the effect of all of this legal jeopardy and now this felony conviction on candidate Trump for 2024 has been an open and evolving question with the public. There was polling in November at the New York Times and Siena College that suggested that if Trump were convicted and sentenced in any one of these cases, a significant number of Trump voters in swing states would switch their support from Trump to Biden, about 6 points overall, certainly enough to cost Trump a close election. In exit polling from the early stages of the Republican presidential nomination, anywhere from 3 in 10 to 4 in 10 voters in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina said Trump being convicted would mean that he was not fit to serve as president. That was January, February of this year. Around the same time, a poll from Bloomberg and the Morning Consult found more than half of registered voters saying Trump would lose their vote if he were found guilty of a crime. Well, now that Trump has been convicted and convicted 34 times, we're no longer talking about this as a hypothetical. It's doubly important to keep in mind that polling voters about a possible future event is notoriously difficult. But because the news gods have a sense of timing, a new poll conducted in May and released today, yes, today, asked voters specifically about the hush money trial in New York, which might be the only trial, of course, to start and finish before the election. This is the new NPR PBS Marist poll, again, released today, but before the verdict. Most voters said a conviction in the hush money trial wouldn't affect their vote, 67% saying it would make no difference. Among overall voters, a conviction might actually benefit Trump by 15 points, mostly among Republicans. The percentage of Republican voters who said they would be less likely to vote for Trump if he got convicted in the hush money trial was down to 10%. Put all those things together, NPR's own headline here is probably instructive. They say, quote, Trump verdict would likely move only a small number of votes, poll finds. But if recent elections, of course, are any indication, a small number of votes is, in a few key places, that's all you need to change the outcome. Jen, you were talking about this in terms of voters that are not necessarily persuadable voters in the traditional sense, but voters whose voting behavior might be affected by a criminal conviction.
Right. And it's, as you said, it's very hard to test a hypothetical, right? Because on one hand, some people who said, yeah, it might make me less likely, this might have happened and they might be like, no, I still like that guy, right? So that's possible. The other piece of it that's very hard to measure in polls is the emotions of it, right? And what people feel about the character. Because some of what is hard to measure is, do people look at him and think there's too much baggage? Or if he's doubling down 4 weeks from now and saying this is like a screwed up system and it's a rigged system. And
got to get rid of all the judges.
And we got to get rid of all the judges and he's attacking the judge and his family. Are people like, this is too much? I don't want to hear him talk about this anymore. It's hard to measure that because people vote by emotions and how somebody makes you feel. So
I think that's such an important and interesting point about how he will react to it and what that will do to his campaigning ability.
Right.
Because it really is a problem for him, the like obsessive Jan 6 lost election grievance. I think as just as a messaging tool for persuadable voters. I think obviously it's very good for the faithful, but him doing like long riffs about Judge Merchan on the stump, I think is not that effective, honestly. Even if the verdict itself doesn't move people, the degree to which he like obsesses about this publicly and consistently as his main campaign message, I think is a possibility.
Well, and that's where his kind of the mantra of the Trump years, which is my grievances are your grievances.
Yes.
I am your retribution.
They could do it to me.
Laura Trump today was tweeting out quotes from her father-in-law saying, they came after me because I'm standing in the way of them and you, effectively. I'm paraphrasing. And that is the answer. It's a way for him to talk about his own travails and then map them onto his supporters.
Well, so many of his supporters have been busted for paying hush money to porn stars to cover up their own
For all of you.
In New York.
For all of you
who
have done a catch and kill to stop,
Who among
to
us?
suppress.
Who among us doesn't have these schemes already lined up with David Pecker and Dylan Howard?
Exactly. I'm here to serve for you. But that's one way where he can keep talking about it and presumably some portion of his supporters.
I'm also just really curious at a are people aware level?
Yeah.
Just as an empirical question, not even does it move people or not. My sense was that a certain portion of the electorate was paying very careful, close attention to this trial.
Yeah.
The majority of voters were not. That there's some universe of voters who didn't know that much about it and who are going to wake up tomorrow or today to the banner headlines everywhere. This will be news that when you ask Americans a week from now, have you heard that Donald Trump was convicted of multiple felonies? They will tell you yes. They will know that. And I'm curious what that does. We don't know.
Yeah, that's such an and there will be money spent, regardless of how the Biden campaign spends their money on ads. Outside groups will spend.
Yes.
There will be a lot of money spent, I would bet on this. The other thing that I think is kind of like interesting to watch here in terms of what Trump does or what he says. I mean, he's addicted to the adulation from his core base, right? And he knows his core base loves this retribution message and loves this message of I'm the victim. So it would require him having some discipline not to seek the adulation from the core of his base in order to talk about other issues. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting things he did today, well, all sorts of things, it was quite a day for him, but was when he was returning to his apartment building, right?
Yeah.
And he kind of turned around and like lifted his fist to raise it to the cameras.
Yeah, he did the two fists at once, which is a very bad
It may
look.
have been like a smart move for a photograph or something, but it was like he was still seeking support or clapping from people
So
to some degree.
I've looked into this moment for a while because it was weird. Because he did the one fist and then he did the two fists and he started to do the motion.
What did you find out? Am I wrong in my assessment here?
No,
it's a TikTok dance.
Maybe
it is.
It will be
I would
soon.
answer it.
Yes.
He was outside Trump Tower, and there were people outside Trump Tower.
Yeah.
But from our reporting, as best as we can tell, from the public-facing reporting that we have seen on this, it was a pretty healthy mix of people who were there to give him a one-finger salute and say, "Neener, neener, you've just been convicted," and a mix of some Trump supporters too. And so he walked up to them, knowing the cameras were on him, sort of pretended like there was a big adoring crowd there, where most of the people were giving him a Bronx cheer. Or, as I said, a one-finger salute. He was sort of cheering a crowd against him, knowing that the cameras were pointing one way and not the other.
Which is kind of fascinating.
Yes.
I mean, and that he did it, but
and his crowds have not turned out to protest for him at the courthouse, except in very small numbers.
That core base loves his message no matter what. Obviously, the core base is not enough to get him elected. Beyond that, he's surrounded by special interest groups who are willing to ignore convictions and everything else as long as they get their thing.
Totally.
Right? Whether it's the NRA, whether it's white evangelicals, whether it's the private equity community.
Fossil fuel
all they're doing
companies.
is checking in. Hey, am I still getting that thing I need? If I am, I'm good to go.
Yeah, but they've also got the counter. They've got the counter example sitting right in front of them with Michael Cohen, right? Which is that you can show Trump all the obsequious, kissing up that you want. You can give him all the campaign donations you want. You can serve him. You can actually take a hit to your own reputation for him. And you might think that you're doing a transactional thing with him. But if the transactional thing doesn't work for him in the end, it's not like he's going to stand by you.
One other aspect of this, we talked about this on my show yesterday, the piece by Eric Levitz I thought was very smart in Vox, which is about the way the electorate is polarizing along lines of high trust, low trust, which is that people that signal lower levels of social trust towards their fellow Americans and trust in institutions are moving right and these are the people who are the least likely to vote. They're sort of the outer perimeter. They're the most alienated. And they're a population that Biden is having the most trouble with. And I do think that one of the issues there is that if folks don't trust the system to begin with, which is that population where you're seeing, in some ways, the largest amount of hemorrhaging in the polling, being like, well, a jury of his peers convicted him may not be that effective a message, honestly. And I think that's a huge part of how everyone's thinking.
Our friend Andrew Weissman, former FBI general counsel, would like to jump in. Andrew, am I right to be advised that you have a question?
I do have a question. I have a question for Jen Psaki because she's always asking me questions.
Oh,
so
I love it.
I'm going to flip the script. And so this probably picks up on what Chris is talking about, which is this was an example today of what judges say all the time about facts and law matter in a court of law. And that I would think is a message that it seems to be Joe Biden's message as well, because he's an institutionalist, and when he took office, he was very much about, I want to restore faith in institutions. And it's also not the case that this verdict didn't just appear. It's based on facts mainly, as people have pointed out, from loyalists to him, just like the January 6th hearings. Why is that not the message that they're sort of jumping on? Even if I get your point, maybe not today because it's not needed, but why isn't that sort of a bigger deal? Is it they don't need to do it because for people like me who believe in facts and law, I'm already, somebody they don't worry about?
I mean, we were just talking about this a little bit. I think that will be a part of the base of the foundation of the message, right? And if you're the White House right now, you're discussing, not today, because as you mentioned, this is the day always that he is down, as you say, in the White House, where he doesn't do any public events, the day that's the anniversary of his son's death. But tomorrow, they will be discussing, how should we frame this? And on every level, what should Karine say from the briefing room? What should the president say when he finally answers the question? They're going to be preparing and debate prep for how they should answer it. And to your point, Andrew, I think President Biden's comfort space, he is an institutionalist, of course, and a defender of the rule of law and institutions, that his comfort place is going to be that. It is the defense of democracy, defense of how our system works, defense of the everyman, as Alan Bragg said today, who was sitting on the jury. I think for them, you make a calculation on the phases and the stages of it. And so tonight was more a stage for, there's a campaign statement they put out. It was longer. That, as I was saying earlier, to me, I read it as more of a message to Democrats out there to say, like, hey, guys, like, there's still a big campaign to be fighting ahead. But they're going to have to determine what their 1,000-foot message is. And I think that what you just said is right in the rubric of what it will sound like, I would expect.